Owen Clark stared at the classified document spread across his desk at the Washington Post, his Pulitzer Prize gleaming on the shelf behind him like a trophy from a war he'd already won. The fluorescent lights of the newsroom buzzed overhead as he highlighted another inconsistency in the Farsi text, not bothering to look up when his translator knocked softly on his office door. He'd broken stories that toppled senators and exposed Pentagon fraud, and this defense contractor investigation would be his crowning achievement, the kind of story that made careers and destroyed empires. His editor girlfriend Rebecca wanted the piece published by Friday to beat the New York Times, and Owen Clark always delivered, always won, always came out on top. Yasmin Tehrani stood in the doorway holding her daughter's hand, her modest headscarf slightly askew from the rush to make it from the daycare pickup to the newsroom on time. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher here than in the cramped basement office where translators worked, surrounded by dictionaries and the ghosts of stories that would never carry their names. She'd translated Owen's documents for 6 months, catching errors that would have tanked her credibility. Yet he'd never once asked her opinion or acknowledged her expertise beyond a curt fine. Send it up. Her fingers unconsciously touched the small gold pin hidden beneath her collar, a journalism award from Tehran University, from a life that no longer existed, from a woman America refused to recognize. The city of Washington stretched outside the newsroom windows, monuments gleaming white against the autumn sky, symbols of truth and justice that felt mockingly distant from this moment. Owen's investigation into Iranian defense contractor fraud would destroy an innocent businessman's reputation, expose a refugee community to further scrutiny, and potentially cost lives in Tehran. And he had no idea because he'd never bothered to actually listen. Yasmin had spent weeks building her own investigation, following threads Owen was too arrogant to see, protecting a whistleblower who'd already lost everything to expose the truth. Tonight, she would have to choose between her livelihood and her integrity, between silence and speaking truth to power, between the safety of invisibility and the danger of being seen. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Owen barely glanced up when Yasmin entered his office, gesturing impatiently at the chair across from his desk, while he finished typing an email to Rebecca about their dinner reservation at the Cosmos Club. His tailored Tom Ford suit jacket hung on the back of his leather chair, his MIT class ring catching the light as he scrolled through his phone, checking the metrics on his last viral story. The office smelled of expensive coffee from the French press he kept in the corner, a luxury that set him apart from the reporters in the bullpen, who drank break room sludge. 2 walls displayed framed front pages featuring his byline, including the expose that won him the Pulitzer 3 years ago, proof that Owen Clark was journalism royalty in a city that worshipped power. The Farsi documents from the Pentagon leak. I need the final translation certified by tomorrow morning, Owen said without preamble, sliding a manila folder across his mahogany desk. His tone suggested he was delegating to an administrative assistant rather than consulting with a professional translator, the same dismissive inflection he used when ordering his assistant to fetch lunch. Yasmin noticed the ink stains on his fingers from his vintage fountain pen, an affectation he claimed helped him think, but really served as another marker of his cultivated sophistication. The documents inside the folder could destroy lives, could ignite international tensions, could cost their source everything, and Owen treated them like just another story to break before the competition. Yasmin opened the folder carefully, her practiced eyes scanning the Farsi script she'd already reviewed twice in the basement translation department. The documents allegedly proved that Reza Ahmadi, a respected Iranian-American businessman and humanitarian, had been funneling money to Revolutionary Guard Front companies through his import-export business. But the Farsi was wrong, not just imperfect, but deliberately fabricated, with grammatical errors no native speaker would make and terminology that didn't match the time periods referenced. She'd spent 3 weeks quietly investigating, reaching out to sources in the Iranian exile community, cross-referencing names and dates that didn't align. Her daughter Layla's face flashed through her mind. If Yasmin challenged Owen publicly, she could lose this job, lose their health insurance, lose the stability they'd fought so hard to build. Mr. Clark, I can't certify this translation, Yasmin said quietly, her English accent thickening slightly with nervousness despite her fluency. Owen's head snapped up from his phone, his expression shifting from distraction to irritation, as if she just told him his coffee was cold. The newsroom beyond his glass walls continued its chaotic rhythm. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, editors shouting across desks, oblivious to the confrontation brewing. Yasmin's hands trembled slightly as she placed the folder back on his desk, but her voice remained steady, her journalism training overriding her immigrant's fear of making waves. Owen leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening in that way Rebecca said made him look dangerously handsome when he was about to eviscerate someone in print. "Excuse me? I've had these documents authenticated by 3 sources. Are you questioning my reporting?" His voice carried the edge of someone unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly by support staff he barely considered part of the journalism process. The MIT ring glinted as he drummed his fingers on the desk, a tell that his colleagues knew meant Owen Clark was about to destroy someone verbally. Yasmin felt the familiar weight of invisibility, the assumption that her hijab meant incompetence, that her accent meant ignorance, that her basement office meant insignificance. "I'm questioning the documents themselves," Yasmin replied, meeting his eyes despite every instinct screaming at her to look away, to apologize, to retreat to the safety of anonymity. She pulled out her own folder from her worn canvas bag, notes compiled over weeks of investigation that Owen had never requested and would never value. The evidence was clear to anyone who actually understood Farsi culture and idiom, but Owen had relied on his authenticated sources, without questioning whether those sources might have their own agendas. Her wedding ring, the only jewelry she'd managed to bring from Tehran, caught the light, a reminder of her husband Dariush, who died for pursuing truth, who taught her that real journalism required courage even when the powerful wanted silence. These documents contained deliberate errors designed to look authentic to non-native speakers. Yasmin continued, her voice gaining strength as she slipped into the analytical mode that once made her the most feared investigative reporter in Tehran. She pointed to specific phrases in the Farsi text, explaining how the formality levels were inconsistent, how certain bureaucratic stamps were from the wrong time period, how the reference bank codes didn't exist in Iran's financial system. Owen's expression shifted from irritation to reluctant attention, his journalist instinct finally overriding his ego enough to actually listen. But then his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, and what he is sniffing around this story, we need to publish now. And his face hardened again. "Look, Yasmin, I appreciate your thoroughness," Owen said, his tone dripping with condescension as he closed her folder without really examining it. "But I have multiple intelligence sources confirming these documents, and Rebecca wants this story on tomorrow's front page. Just certify the translation, and let me worry about the journalism." He turned back to his computer, dismissing her with body language as clearly as if he'd wave his hand, his fingers already typing the lead that would destroy Reza Ahmadi's reputation and career. The newsroom's energy pulsed beyond the glass walls. Deadline pressure, competitive fire, the addictive rush of breaking news that Owen lived for and that had once consumed Yasmin's life too. She stood slowly, carefully gathering her papers, her mind already calculating the cost of what she was about to do. Yasmin walked back to the basement translation department, her sensible flat silent on the industrial carpet that marked the division between the prestigious newsroom upstairs and the support staff below. The fluorescent lights flickered worse down here, casting shadows across the cramped cubicles where translators worked in 6 different languages, invisible architects of stories that would never carry their names. Her colleague Maria looked up from a Spanish document, reading the tension in Yasmin's face and offering a sympathetic smile that needed no translation. The basement smelled of old paper and cheap air freshener, so different from the coffee and ambition scent of Owen's world, a physical reminder of how America had relegated her expertise to the margins. She opened her personal laptop, not the Post equipment, because this investigation was hers alone, and pulled up the files she'd been building for 3 months. Reza Ahmadi wasn't a terrorist financier, but a whistleblower, a former Iranian Defense Ministry official who'd risked everything to expose a massive fraud scheme involving American defense contractors. The forged documents Owen was about to publish were designed to discredit Reza before he could testify to Congress about the $3 billion weapons contract based on fabricated intelligence. Yasmin had the real story, interviews with Reza's associates, Financial records showing the actual money trail, evidence of how deep the corruption ran. But she was just a translator, just an immigrant, just a woman whose journalism credentials died with her husband in Tehran. Her phone buzzed with a text from the daycare. Layla fell and scraped her knee, nothing serious but asking for mama. Yasmin's heart clenched with the familiar guilt of working motherhood, amplified by the refugees' constant fear that one mistake, one absence, one moment of imperfection would prove she didn't belong here. She texted back that she'd be there soon, then looked at the documents spread across her desk. Evidence that could stop Owen's story, expose the real conspiracy, save Reza's life. But using this evidence meant revealing herself, meant stepping out of the shadows she'd learned to inhabit, meant risking everything she'd built in 5 years of careful invisibility in America. Yasmin thought of Dariush, remembering the night he'd published his expose of corruption in Iran's judiciary despite knowing the Revolutionary Guard was watching. He'd kissed her and 4-year-old Layla goodbye at dawn, walked into his newsroom and never come home. Gunned down in the parking garage by men who were never arrested. She'd fled Iran with Layla 3 weeks later, leaving behind her career, her awards, her identity as one of Tehran's most respected investigative journalists. America had offered safety but not recognition. Immigration officials didn't care that she won Iran's equivalent of a Pulitzer, that she'd broken stories that changed laws, that she'd once been somebody who made the powerful tremble. The basement door opened and Owen appeared, unusual enough that several translators looked up in surprise. Executives rarely descended to their level. He carried the Farsi documents, his expression harder than before, and Yasmin realized Rebecca must have escalated the pressure. The newsroom grapevine said Rebecca was angling for a promotion to senior editor, that she'd been pushing Owen to take more risks, to publish faster, to prioritize scoops over thorough verification. Something flickered in Yasmin's memory, an unexplained lunch meeting she'd seen between Rebecca and a man whose photo later appeared in the defense contractor files. But she pushed the thought aside as Owen approached her cubicle. "I need you to sign off on this translation by 5 p.m., Owen said, placing the documents on her desk like a judge delivering a verdict. His cologne, expensive cedar-scented, filled the cramped space, a sensory reminder of the class divide between them. Around them, other translators suddenly became very interested in their work, understanding that witnessing a confrontation between an executive and support staff could only bring trouble. Owen's MIT ring caught the fluorescent light, and Yasmin noticed his hand was shaking slightly. Not nervousness, but caffeine, the journalist's fuel, the mark of someone who lived on deadline adrenaline and competition. "And if I refuse?" Yasmin asked quietly, her English perfect now, her accent disappearing as it sometimes did when she channeled the journalist she used to be. Owen blinked, clearly not expecting resistance from someone he'd mentally categorized as a glorified Google Translate app. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the space itself recognized the weight of this moment. Yasmin's colleagues had stopped even pretending to work, sensing that something important was happening in their forgotten corner of the Washington Post. "Then I'll find another translator who understands how journalism works," Owen snapped, his patience exhausted by a day of Rebecca's pressure, competition anxiety, and now this unexpected defiance from support staff. He turned to leave, then paused, his journalist instinct finally overriding his arrogance. "Why? Why would you refuse? Do you have information I don't?" The question came out sharper than he intended. But for the first time, Owen was actually asking rather than dismissing, actually seeing Yasmin as a potential source rather than an obstacle. Yasmin made a decision that would change everything. The kind of decision Dariush would have been proud of, the kind that defined who you really were when comfort and principle collided. She pulled out her personal investigation files, months of work done on her own time, in her own language, following threads that Owen's arrogance had blinded him to. The documents were meticulous. Interviews transcribed in Farsi and English, financial records traced through 6 shell companies, photos of meetings between defense contractor executives and the men who'd forged the documents Owen was about to publish. Her hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by the calm focus she'd learned in Tehran newsrooms, where every story could mean death, but silence meant complicity. "I have the real story," Yasmin said simply, spreading her files across the desk between them. Owen stared at the documents, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and then reluctant fascination as his eyes caught specific details: bank routing numbers, sworn statements, photographic evidence. The other translators watched openly now, sensing that their quiet colleague was revealing herself as something unexpected, something powerful. Maria whispered "Dios mío" under her breath, recognizing the look of a real journalist at work, the kind of sourcing and documentation that took months of dangerous investigation to compile. Owen pulled up a chair from an empty cubicle, his body language shifting from confrontational to investigative as he began reading Yasmin's work. The documents showed that the defense contractor, Sentinel Defense Systems, had created the forged Iranian papers to justify a $3 billion weapons contract based on fabricated intelligence about Iranian threat capabilities. Reza Mahdi, the businessman Owen was about to destroy, was actually their whistleblower, a former Iranian defense official who discovered the fraud and was preparing to testify to Congress. The forged documents were designed to discredit Reza before he could expose conspiracy, and Owen's story would be the torpedo that sank him. "Where did you get this?" Owen demanded, his voice lacking its earlier condescension, but filled with professional intensity. He was reading an interview transcript with a Sentinel executive who drunkenly confessed to paying for the forged documents, not realizing he was talking to a Farsi translator who understood exactly what he'd revealed. Yasmin had 6 more interviews like it, each one carefully documented, each source protected, each fact triple verified in the way real investigative journalists work when they can't afford mistakes. Owen's hands tightened on the papers, and Yasmin saw the moment his competitive journalist brain recognized that she'd done what he'd failed to do, actual reporting instead of just processing leaked documents. "I did what you're supposed to do. I reported," Yasmin replied, her voice carrying the weight of a career Owen knew nothing about. She pulled out her phone and showed him photos of documents from Tehran, journalism awards with her name in Farsi script, archived articles she'd written that exposed government corruption and pharmaceutical fraud. Owen scrolled through the images, his expression transforming from skepticism to shock as he realized the translator he'd treated like office equipment was actually a decorated investigative journalist. The newsroom above them was preparing to publish a lie, and the truth was sitting in a basement cubicle with a woman he'd never bothered to actually see. Owen's phone exploded with text from Rebecca. "Where are you? Story needs to go to press. Legal has cleared it. NYT is publishing their version tomorrow." The pressure was immense, the competitive instinct screaming at him to publish, to win, to claim the scoop before the competition. But Yasmin's documents were undeniable, her sourcing was solid, and Owen's journalist integrity, buried under years of ambition and arrogance, but not quite dead, recognized that publishing his current story would destroy an innocent man and bury the real scandal. He looked at Yasmin, really looked at her for the first time, seeing not a translator but a colleague, seeing not support staff but a reporter who'd risked everything to protect the truth. "Why didn't you tell me you were a journalist?" Owen asked, the question revealing his fundamental misunderstanding of how power worked, how invisibility wasn't chosen but imposed. Yasmin could have laughed at the absurdity, as if her journalism credentials mattered when immigration officials saw only her headscarf, when HR categorized her resume as foreign experience, not applicable, when America decided that awards from Tehran counted for nothing. She'd tried mentioning her background when she was first hired, had been met with polite smiles and patronizing questions about how journalism works differently over there, had learned that in America, her past made her suspicious rather than credible. "I did tell you," Yasmin said quietly, watching Owen's face as he processed the implications. "In my job interview, when I translated your first documents, when I pointed out errors in your sourcing 6 months ago, you just never heard me." The words landed like punches, each one a reminder of conversations Owen had dismissed, insights he'd ignored, expertise he'd wasted because he'd categorized Yasmin as support staff rather than seeing her as the professional she'd always been. The basement fluorescent lights flickered, and somewhere upstairs, Rebecca was probably calling Owen's cell phone, demanding to know why he wasn't filing the story that would win them both accolades and advance their careers. Owen sat in the cramped basement cubicle, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial furniture, reading through Yasmin's investigation with growing horror at what he'd almost published. Each page revealed another layer of the conspiracy, Sentinel Defense Systems had spent 18 months creating the perfect fraud, hiring former intelligence operatives to forge Iranian documents that would pass cursory authentication. The $3 billion contract was for weapon systems based on inflated threat assessments, designed to line executive pockets, while American troops would eventually deploy equipment justified by lies. Reza Mahdi had discovered the fraud while working as a consultant, had gathered evidence at enormous personal risk, and was scheduled to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 3 days, unless Owen's story destroyed his credibility first. Reza's family is still in Iran, Yasmin explained, pulling up secure messaging apps that Owen didn't recognize, showing him coded communications with sources who corroborated every detail. If I reveal him as my source publicly, they're dead. The Revolutionary Guard has already questioned his brother twice. That's why I've been building the case carefully, waiting for the right moment to publish safely. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, showing Owen financial trails that connected Sentinel executives to offshore accounts, to shell companies in Dubai and Singapore, to a web of corruption that made his Pentagon leak look like amateur hour. The careful documentation, the patient verification, the source protection. This was journalism the way Owen had learned at MIT before ambition and competition had made him sloppy. Owen's phone buzzed again. Rebecca calling, her 5th attempt in 10 minutes. He declined the call, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with dread, because he knew what was coming. The argument, the accusations of being soft, the pressure to publish anyway and let the chips fall. But Yasmin's evidence was overwhelming. Her reporting was cleaner than anything he'd produced in years, and the real story was infinitely bigger than the fabricated scandal he'd been about to break. He looked at this woman he'd dismissed as a translator, seeing now the scars on her hands from notebook spirals, the permanent ink stains on her fingers, the weary determination in her eyes that marked every real journalist who'd ever chased truth into dangerous places. "I need to call Rebecca and kill the story," Owen said, the words tasting like failure even though he knew they represented integrity. Yasmin nodded, already pulling up additional files that would make the real investigation publishable, the documented fraud, the whistleblower's testimony, the congressional angle that would make this story national news for weeks. But Owen's hand hesitated over his phone, because killing the story meant admitting he'd been wrong, meant confessing he relied on fabricated evidence, meant acknowledging he'd been outreported by a basement translator. The MIT ring suddenly felt heavy on his finger, a symbol of prestige that meant nothing if he published lies. Before Owen could make the call, Yasmin's phone rang with a number that made her face go pale. Reza's emergency contact code. She answered in rapid Farsi, her expression shifting from concern to alarm as the whistleblower explained that someone had leaked information about his planned congressional testimony. Sentinel executives were moving to discredit him preemptively, hiring crisis PR firms and preparing their own media blitz. Owen watched Yasmin's face, understanding enough from context to realize their window was closing fast, that the conspiracy was adapting, that journalism had become a race against time and corporate power. Yasmin ended the call and turned to Owen, her decision made. "We publish the real story tonight, together, before Sentinel can destroy Reza's credibility and bury the fraud." Owen blinked at the word together, his brain struggling to process the idea of sharing a byline with a translator, sharing credit for a story he thought was his exclusive. But Yasmin's reporting was a story. Her sources, her documents, her months of dangerous investigation while he'd been chasing a fabricated lead. Professional pride warred with journalistic integrity, ambition fought with ethics, and Owen realized this was a moment that would define what kind of reporter he actually was. "We'll need Rebecca's approval to run this tonight," Owen said, already knowing that conversation would be a disaster. Yasmin shook her head, her expression suggesting she knew something Owen didn't, something that made trusting Rebecca dangerous. She pulled up one more file on her laptop, this one showing photos she'd taken outside the Capitol Grill 3 weeks ago. Rebecca having an intimate lunch with Marcus Webb, Sentinel Defense Systems Vice President of Government Relations. The photos showed documents being exchanged, envelopes being passed, the unmistakable body language of conspiracy rather than casual journalism sourcing. "Rebecca's being paid to push your story," Yasmin said quietly, watching Owen's face as the implications crashed over him. The woman he'd been dating for 8 months, the editor he trusted with his career, the colleague he'd planned to celebrate with tonight. She was par conspiracy. Owen felt his world tilting. The certainty he'd operated with for years suddenly revealed as willful blindness. Rebecca hadn't been pushing him to publish fast because of competition. She'd been pushing because Sentinel needed Owen's prestigious byline to legitimize their fabricated documents before Reza could testify. Owen had been a weapon, carefully aimed at an innocent man by people who'd bought his girlfriend's loyalty. Owen stared at the photos of Rebecca and Marcus Webb, his mind racing through 8 months of relationship memories now contaminated by betrayal. The expensive dinners Webb had coincidentally recommended, the insider tips about Pentagon sources Rebecca had provided, her unusual interest in his investigation's timeline, details that seemed like supportive girlfriend behavior now revealed themselves as espionage. Yasmin watched him process the betrayal, her expression sympathetic but not pitying, the look of someone who'd experienced worse treachery and survived. The basement's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, marking seconds in a crisis that demanded immediate action while Owen's personal world collapsed. "How long have you known?" Owen asked, his voice raw with humiliation that this translator had recognized his girlfriend's corruption while he'd remained oblivious. Yasmin pulled up a timeline showing Rebecca's meetings with Webb, carefully documented over 3 months of surveillance that Yasmin had conducted while translating Owen's documents by day. She recognized Webb's face from Sentinel's corporate filings, had followed Rebecca after noticing her leaving the office during times that didn't match her calendar, had done the basic investigative work that Owen had been too arrogant or too trusting to consider. The evidence was damning. 6 documented meetings, financial transfers to an offshore account in Rebecca's name, encrypted emails that Yasmin had managed to access through a source in Sentinel's IT department. "Long enough to build a case," Yasmin replied, her fingers already typing up the outline of the story they needed to publish within hours. She'd been preparing for this moment, understanding that eventually Owen would have to see the truth, that the conspiracy would force a confrontation. But she'd also been protecting him, waiting until she had enough evidence that he couldn't dismiss it, couldn't rationalize it, couldn't retreat into the cognitive dissonance that powerful men use to avoid uncomfortable truths. The translator he'd barely noticed had been running a parallel investigation into the very conspiracy that had seduced his girlfriend and nearly destroyed his career. Owen's phone erupted with an incoming call from Rebecca again, and this time he answered, putting it on speaker so Yasmin could hear. "Where the hell are you? Legal is holding the front page. The publisher is asking questions, and I'm getting texts that you're in the basement with the translator." Rebecca's voice carried the sharp edge of panic dressed as anger, the tone of someone whose carefully constructed scheme was unraveling. Owen met Yasmin's eyes, seeing in them the steady determination of someone who'd faced down worse threats than an editor's fury. He took a breath and made his choice. "I'm killing the story. Rebecca, the documents are forged." Owen's words landed like grenades, the silence on the other end stretching for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Yasmin pulled up the audio recording software she prepared, capturing this conversation for the evidence files she'd need when this went public. The basement had become ground zero for journalism that mattered, for truth that could stop a $3 billion fraud, for the kind of reporting that had once made Owen care about the profession beyond prizes and prestige. Rebecca's voice turned cold, calculating. "Owen, you're making a career-ending mistake. I have 3 sources confirming those documents. The Times is going to scoop us. Think about what you're throwing away." The manipulation was expertly done, hitting every pressure point. Professional reputation, competitive anxiety, the fear of being wrong publicly. Owen felt the familiar pull of those arguments, the seductive logic that had driven his career for a decade. But Yasmin was already pulling up more evidence on her laptop, showing him the electronic trail of Rebecca's communications with Sentinel, the payments disguised as consulting fees, the explicit instructions to ensure Owen published before congressional testimony. "Your sources are Sentinel operatives, and you know it," Owen said, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced shock. "How much did they pay you, Rebecca? How much was I worth as their useful idiot?" Yasmin flinched at the self-recrimination in his tone, recognizing particular pain of realizing you'd been manipulated by someone you loved. She'd felt that same betrayal when colleagues in Tehran had revealed her husband's investigation to the Revolutionary Guard, had learned that trust could be weaponized, that intimacy made the best cover for treachery. Rebecca's facade cracked. You're going to believe a translator over me? Some refugee who probably can't even verify her own credentials? Owen, she's playing you, can't you see that? The racism wasn't even subtle anymore. The desperation revealing prejudices that Rebecca had carefully hidden during their relationship. Yasmin's expression didn't change, but Owen saw her hand tighten on her pen. The small tell of someone absorbing an insult they'd heard countless times before. His stomach churned with shame at how many times he'd probably said similar things, how many times he'd dismissed Yasmin with the same casual prejudice Rebecca now weaponized. Yasmin's a Pulitzer-level investigative journalist who's been doing actual reporting while I've been chasing fabricated leads. Owen snapped back, surprised by how defensive he felt, how protective. And she's got documentation of your meetings with Marcus Webb, your offshore accounts, and your role in this conspiracy. So you can either resign now or wait for the FBI investigation that's coming when we publish the real story. Yasmin's eyes widened slightly. Owen was improvising now, committing to consequences he hadn't fully thought through, burning bridges with professional recklessness. But the fierce satisfaction in his voice suggested this felt right in a way his carefully calculated career moves never had. The phone went silent, Rebecca having apparently hung up or temporarily retreated to regroup, and the basement suddenly felt charged with the energy of journalists on the hunt. Yasmin and Owen worked side by side, her explaining the architecture of the fraud while he drafted the story framework. Two professionals finally operating as equals. Maria brought coffee from the break room, whispering, "About time someone put Owen Clark in his place," her grin suggesting the translators had been waiting years for this moment. Other basement colleagues drifted over, offering technical assistance, translation verification, the quiet solidarity of support staff watching one of their own claim the recognition she deserved. Owen called his most trusted editor, Jim Martinez, who'd mentored him since his MIT internship and still maintained old-school standards about verification and source protection. Jim listened to the story, the forged documents, Rebecca's betrayal, Yasmin's investigation, the Sentinel conspiracy, with the careful attention of a journalist who'd survived 30 years in Washington by knowing when to trust his gut. He agreed to meet them in Conference Room C in 20 minutes to review Yasmin's evidence and make the call about publishing tonight. The Post's reputation was on the line, but so was the truth about a $3 billion fraud that would cost American lives if the weapons contract went through. Yasmin gathered her files while Owen made calls to pull together the reporting team they'd need. A financial analyst to verify the offshore accounts, a Pentagon correspondent to contextualize the defense contract, a legal expert to review for libel exposure. Each call revealed Owen's power within the Post, his ability to mobilize resources and bypass bureaucracy, privileges Yasmin had never accessed despite equivalent expertise. She watched him work, seeing both the impressive professional competence and the systemic advantages that had allowed him to fail upward while she'd been relegated to a basement cubicle. The anger she felt wasn't personal. It was structural. The recognition of how differently their careers had been treated by an institution that valued credentials from MIT over awards from Tehran. They rode the elevator to the third-floor conference room, Yasmin clutching her files while Owen reviewed notes on his phone, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. When had she realized he was being manipulated? Why had she protected him instead of just taking her story elsewhere? What did she want from this partnership beyond stopping the fraud? Owen's reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a man whose certainty had been stripped away, whose confidence had curdled into shame, whose career success suddenly looked like accidental mediocrity enabled by privilege. Yasmin's reflection showed exhaustion and determination, the face of someone who'd been fighting invisible battles for years. Jim Martinez was already in the conference room when they arrived, along with the Post's legal counsel Sarah Chun and publisher Howard Grant. Their presence indicating this had already escalated to the executive level. Owen felt his stomach drop. Rebecca must have called him first, spinning her version of events, positioning herself as a reasonable editor protecting the paper from a rogue reporter and suspicious foreign translator. But Jim's expression was thoughtfully neutral rather than hostile, suggesting he was at least willing to hear their evidence before making judgments. Yasmin set her files on the conference table with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that immigrants couldn't afford to look disorganized or unprepared. Rebecca says you're killing a vetted story based on claims from translator with no verifiable American credentials, Howard began, his tone suggesting he wanted to believe Owen, but couldn't ignore the political implications. She's already contacted our attorney about potential litigation if we publish what she's calling conspiracy theories from a source with questionable loyalties. The phrase questionable loyalties landed like a slap. The casual xenophobia of assuming Yasmin's Iranian heritage made her inherently suspicious. Owen opened his mouth to respond, but Yasmin spoke first, her voice clear and professional as she began laying out her evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd anticipated exactly this skepticism. My credentials are verifiable through the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which documented my work exposing pharmaceutical fraud in Tehran, Yasmin said, sliding her authentication letters across the table. I won Iran's National Journalism Award in 2018, which you can confirm through their archived records. My husband, Dariush Tehrani, was murdered for his reporting on judiciary corruption, documented by Reporters Without Borders. I hold a master's degree in investigative journalism from Tehran University, equivalent to Columbia's program, with thesis work on financial fraud investigation that formed the basis for my methodology here. Each sentence demolished Rebecca's attempt to dismiss her as unqualified, each credential more impressive than Owen's MIT degree and inherited connections. Sarachin examined the documents while Jim pulled up Yasmin's archived articles on his laptop, translating the Farsi headlines that showed she'd broken major corruption stories that had resulted in ministerial resignations and criminal prosecutions. The pharmaceutical fraud investigation alone had exposed a scheme involving $500 million in counterfeit medications, leading to reforms in Iran's drug regulation system. Owen watched his colleague's expressions shift from skepticism to impressed recognition, realizing that Yasmin's journalism resume made his Pulitzer look like a participation trophy. She'd worked in a country where investigative journalism could get you killed, where sources disappeared into prisons, where every story required courage that American reporters rarely needed. Howard leaned forward, his publisher's instinct recognizing a bigger story. Walk me through the Sentinel fraud. Yasmin pulled up her presentation, a 60-slide deck she prepared over weeks, anticipating this moment. She showed the forged documents' inconsistencies, the financial trail connecting Sentinel executives to offshore accounts, the photographic evidence of Rebecca's meetings with Marcus Webb, the whistleblower testimony that would corroborate everything. Each slide was meticulously sourced, each claim backed by multiple verification points, each connection traced through corporate filings and financial records that Yasmin had accessed through a network of international journalists and Iranian exile sources. The conference room fell silent as Yasmin finished her presentation, the evidence so overwhelming that even the most skeptical editor couldn't dismiss it. Jim Martinez whistled low. This is Pulitzer-level work, Yasmin. Why didn't you bring this to us months ago? Yasmin met his eyes, her expression making clear that she learned the hard way how American newsrooms treated foreign journalists who challenged established hierarchies. She'd been the translator, the basement support staff, the woman whose accent and headscarf marked her as perpetually foreign. Bringing an investigation like this to leadership would have meant being dismissed as overstepping her role or suspected of having suspicious Iranian loyalties. Owen felt the shame burn deeper, understanding how his own arrogance had contributed to a system that wasted Yasmin's talent. He'd walked past her cubicle for 6 months, had corrected her poor English in meetings where she was actually right and he was wrong, had treated her expertise as clerical support rather than professional journalism. The Pulitzer on his shelf suddenly felt unearned, a prize won partly through privilege and institutional access, while reporters like Yasmin fought invisible battles just to be heard. He started to apologize but stopped, realizing that this moment required action rather than words, that the only redemption available was ensuring her story got published under her own byline. Howard made the call. We publish tonight. Front page, above the fold. Owen and Yasmin co-byline, with full credit to Yasmin for the investigation. He looked at Owen directly. You were the senior reporter on this. You almost published a fabricated story that would have destroyed an innocent man and buried a massive fraud. That's on you. But you're also stepping up now to publish the truth, which count for something. The words were harsh but fair, the kind of accountability Owen had dished out in his reporting, but rarely face himself. Yasmin remained quiet, her expression revealing nothing, though Owen suspected she was calculating whether Kobeline meant her contribution would be buried in the second paragraph or properly credited as a lead investigator. Saracen raised a legal question everyone was avoiding. Rebecca's going to claim wrongful termination, possibly sue for defamation. We need to be bulletproof on the evidence of her cooperation with Sentinel. Yasmin had anticipated this too, pulling up a separate file that showed not just photos but bank records, encrypted emails she'd obtained through a source at Sentinel, and testimony from a Sentinel employee who'd witnessed Rebecca receiving payment instructions. The documentation was so thorough that Sarah actually smiled. "Where'd you learn to build a case like this?" "This is FBI-level evidence gathering." "For my husband," Yasmin said quietly, her voice carrying grief that had aged into determination. "Dariush taught me that in countries where journalism is dangerous, you can't afford to be sloppy. Every source must be protected. Every claim must be verified 3 times. Every piece of evidence must be documented so thoroughly that even your murder can't bury the truth." The room absorbed the weight of that statement, the reminder that Yasmin had learned investigative journalism in a context where mistakes meant death, where courage wasn't metaphorical but literal. Owen's competitive career anxieties suddenly seemed pathetically trivial compared to the stakes Yasmin had operated under. Jim assigned a support team. Financial reporters to verify the offshore accounts, Pentagon correspondents to contextualize the defense contract fraud, legal experts to review the evidence against Rebecca. The newsroom shifted into the familiar urgency of breaking news. But this time Yasmin was at the center rather than the margins, directing reporting from the conference room, while Owen watched her command respect he'd taken for granted his entire career. Reporters who'd never spoken to her before now sought her expertise, asking about Iranian financial systems, Revolutionary Guard operations, the nuances of Farsi document authentication. She answered each question with patient precision, the teacher educating colleagues who'd never bothered to learn. The story came together over 6 hours of intensive reporting, with Yasmin writing the investigative sections while Owen handled the Pentagon's sourcing and congressional implications. Their writing styles were different, hers more detailed and methodical, his more aggressive and narrative-driven, but merged into something stronger than either could produce alone. Around 9 p.m., Yasmin's phone buzzed with a call from Layla's babysitter, reminding her that her daughter existed beyond this newsroom crisis. She stepped out to reassure Layla that Mama would be home soon. Her voice softened Farsi as she explained that she was working on something important, something that might change their lives. Owen overheard part of the conversation, understanding enough to recognize the guilt in Yasmin's tone, the working mother's eternal calculus of choosing between career and child. When she returned, he asked, "How old is Layla?" It was the first personal question he'd ever asked, the first time he'd acknowledged Yasmin as a human with a life beyond her utility to him. Yasmin showed him a photo on her phone, a beautiful 9-year-old girl with her mother's eyes and her father's smile, wearing a soccer uniform and holding a trophy. "She's brilliant," Yasmin said with fierce pride. "Wants to be a journalist like her parents. I'm doing this partly so she grows up in a country where truth still matters." The comment hit Owen harder than intended, forcing him to confront how his ambition had made him complicit in corrupting the journalism he claimed to value. He'd been so focused on winning, beating the Times, impressing Rebecca, adding to his prize collection, that he'd lost sight of why journalism mattered. Yasmin had lost her husband to the pursuit of truth, had fled her country, had worked in basements and shadows, and still maintained the integrity Owen had nearly traded for a front-page scoop. He pulled up the draft story on his laptop and made a decision. Your name goes first on the byline. This is your investigation. At 11 p.m., the story went live on the Washington Post website with Yasmin Tehrani's name in the primary byline position, a detail that would shock the journalism community and infuriate Rebecca. The headline read, "Defense contractor fabricated Iranian intelligence to justify $3 billion weapons contract. Whistleblower reveals." The story was devastating, meticulously sourced, and named Rebecca Sawyer as a co-conspirator who'd accepted $250,000 in payments to manipulate Post coverage. Within minutes, it was trending on social media, with journalists from competing outlets retweeting in amazement at the scope of the fraud and the unknown translator who'd broken it. Yasmin stood in the newsroom watching the story propagate across screens, her expression caught between satisfaction and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe she reclaimed her identity as a journalist. Rebecca's resignation came at midnight via a terse email to Howard, followed immediately by her attorney's letter threatening litigation. Sarachin laughed reading it. She's going to have trouble suing when the FBI opens a corruption investigation tomorrow morning. Owen called his FBI source, confirming that the Bureau was already reviewing Yasmin's evidence and preparing to interview Sentinel executives. The defense contract was being suspended pending congressional investigation, and Reza Mahdi was being moved into protective custody along with his family members who could be evacuated from Iran. The story Yasmin had built was dismantling a conspiracy that had operated for 18 months, and she'd done it from a basement cubicle with no official authority. The newsroom erupted in celebration around 1 a.m. when the New York Times posted their own version of the story, citing the Post's reporting and effectively conceding the scoop. Jim Martinez brought champagne to the conference room where Yasmin and Owen were still working on follow-up angles, toasting the best damn investigator reporting this paper has published in 5 years. Other reporters crowded in, wanting to meet the mysterious translator who'd outreported everyone, asking Yasmin questions about her methodology and sources. She answered with characteristic precision but obvious discomfort, and used to being the center of attention after years of deliberate invisibility. Owen watched Yasmin navigate the sudden recognition, seeing how she deflected credit to her sources and focused on the importance of the story rather than her own role. The humility wasn't false modesty, but genuine principle, the mark of someone who'd learned journalism in a context where ego was dangerous and the story mattered more than the byline. When a reporter asked about her background, Yasmin simply said she'd worked in journalism before coming to America, not mentioning the awards or her husband's murder or the career she'd lost. Owen found himself wanting to tell her story, to make sure people understood what she'd sacrificed and overcome, but recognized that wasn't a story to tell. Around 3 a.m., when the newsroom finally quieted, Owen and Yasmin sat alone in the conference room with the city lights of Washington spread below them. "I owe you an apology," Owen began, but Yasmin shook her head. "You owe me a proper job," she corrected, her tone light but eyes serious. "A staff position as an investigative reporter, with the salary and title that reflect my experience. Not as a favor, but because I've earned it." Owen pulled out his phone and texted Jim Martinez right then. "We need to create a senior investigative reporter position. I'm recommending Yasmin Tehrani. Non-negotiable." Jim's response came immediately, already drafting the offer letter. The next morning's front page featured Yasmin and Owen's story with a sidebar about how the investigation was conducted, crediting Yasmin's expertise in Iranian intelligence and financial fraud investigation. The Post publisher wrote a note acknowledging that the paper had failed to recognize Yasmin's credentials and pledging to review hiring practices for foreign journalists. Cable news shows began calling for interviews, Congress scheduled emergency hearings, and the FBI confirmed that Rebecca and 3 Sentinel executives were under investigation for fraud and conspiracy. Yasmin's phone buzzed constantly with messages from Iranian exiled journalists, former colleagues from Tehran, and American reporters who'd never known her story. Owen picked up Yasmin at her modest apartment in Arlington that afternoon to drive her to the Post for the press conference, finding her transformed from the basement translator he'd dismissed. She wore a professional burgundy suit that Howard's assistant had helped her shop for that morning, her hair styled elegantly, her presence radiating the confidence of someone reclaiming her identity. Layla stood beside her mother, dressed in her school uniform, clutching a copy of the Post with her mother's name on the front page. "Mama's famous now," Layla announced proudly, and Yasmin hugged her daughter with tears in her eyes that had nothing to do with the Pulitzer Prize everyone was already predicting. The press conference was surreal. Yasmin fielding questions from journalists who yesterday wouldn't have known her name, explaining her methodology and sources with the same precision she brought to every translation Owen had ignored. She spoke about the importance of protecting whistleblowers like Reza, about how immigration shouldn't erase professional credentials, about the Iranian journalists still fighting for truth in dangerous conditions. Owen sat beside her, realizing he was witnessing not just professional rehabilitation, but the emergence of a voice American journalism desperately needed. When asked about their partnership, Yasmin was diplomatic. Owen had the courage to listen when his evidence didn't match reality. That's rare. 3 months later, Owen and Yasmin published their comprehensive investigation of the Sentinel fraud, winning them both the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. The award ceremony in New York was packed with journalists who'd followed their unlikely partnership, the privileged MIT graduate and the refugee translator who'd taught him humility. Yasmin's acceptance speech focused on Dariush and other journalists who died pursuing truth, dedicating her award to their memory, and a refugee journalist struggling for recognition in America. Owen's speech was shorter, acknowledging that he'd almost destroyed an innocent man's life and buried a massive fraud because he'd been too arrogant to listen to the most qualified person in the room. The defense contract was permanently canceled, saving taxpayers $3 billion and preventing deployment of faulty weapon systems that would have cost American lives. Rebecca pled guilty to conspiracy and received 3 years in federal prison, while Sentinel CEO and 2 executives faced fraud charges that would keep them in court for years. Reza Ahmadi testified to Congress about the deeper patterns of defense contractor fraud, his credibility restored, and his family safely resettled in the United States. The story sparked congressional investigations into procurement fraud and media corruption, changing how defense contracts were vetted and how journalists' relationships with sources were disclosed. 6 months after the Pulitzer, Owen and Yasmin were assigned to co-investigate a massive pharmaceutical fraud case involving American companies and Iranian shell corporations, their combined expertise making them the Post's premier investigative team. They worked from adjacent offices rather than across hierarchical divides. Their partnership built on mutual respect and complementary skills. Yasmin had been promoted to senior investigative reporter with a salary that finally reflected her expertise, while Owen had learned to share credit and question his assumptions, becoming a better journalist through humility. The romantic feelings developed slowly, professionally inappropriate at first, but undeniable as they spent 18-hour days building cases and protecting sources together. Owen watched Yasmin interview witnesses in 3 languages, admired her methodical approach to evidence gathering, and found himself thinking about her laugh when they discovered a breakthrough source. Yasmin saw past Owen's arrogance to the dedicated journalist underneath, appreciated his writing talent and institutional knowledge, and caught herself looking forward to their morning coffee discussions about investigative angles. But both were cautious, aware of power dynamics and professional boundaries. Neither wanted to jeopardize the partnership that had transformed both their careers. The breakthrough came during a stakeout outside a pharmaceutical executive's summer home in the Hamptons. 12 hours of waiting in Owen's car while they documented suspicious meetings. Owen asked about Dariush, really asked rather than the perfunctory condolences people usually offered, and Yasmin found herself telling the whole story, how they'd met at journalism school, how he'd supported her career even when Iranian society pressured women to stay home, how his murder had destroyed her world but also forged her determination. He'd be proud of what you've accomplished, Owen said quietly, and Yasmin nodded. He'd also tell me I'm allowed to be happy again. Owen understood the implicit permission in that statement, the acknowledgement of feelings they'd both been avoiding. Would it be completely inappropriate if I kissed you right now? He asked, his usual confidence replaced by nervous hope. Yasmin smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression he'd seen from her. Probably, but we've already blown up every other professional norm. So why stop now? Their first kiss happened at sunset on a Hamptons back road. 2 investigative journalists taking a risk on something that couldn't be sourced or verified, only felt. Their relationship remained private for months while they navigated complexity of dating a colleague, especially given their complicated professional history. Yasmin insisted they disclose to Jim Martinez in HR, ensuring no ethics violations or conflict of interest. Owen introduced Yasmin and Layla to his family summer house in Cape Cod, watching his MIT-educated parents realize that this refugee translator was smarter and more accomplished than anyone they'd expected their son to bring home. Yasmin brought Owen to Iranian exile community events in McLean, where he met journalists who lost everything to pursue truth, understanding the context that had shaped the woman he loved. The proposal happened at the Newsroom on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Owen kneeling in front of the First Amendment tablets, while Yasmin laughed and cried simultaneously. "You're such a journalist," she said, kissing him while Layla took photos on her phone, already planning to write about this for her school newspaper. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Post's rooftop garden, attended by Iranian exiled journalists, Owen's family, and the newsroom colleagues who'd watched their partnership evolve from hostile hierarchy to love. Jim Martinez officiated, joking that he performed the most important edit of Owen's life when he'd force him to actually listen to Yasmin. Yasmin was 3 months pregnant when her first solo front-page story appeared, an investigation into how immigration officials were systematically denying credential recognition to foreign journalists, forcing talented reporters into menial jobs while American newsrooms complained about talent shortages. The story sparked policy changes at major news organizations and led to a fellowship program at the Post for refugee journalists, funded partly by Yasmin and Owen's Pulitzer Prize money. Owen watched her accept the George Polk Award for the series, her baby bump visible under her elegant dress, and thought about how close he'd come to destroying both her life and his own through arrogance and carelessness. Their daughter was born in spring, named Dariush Clark Tehrani in honor of the husband Yasmin had lost, and the journalism values both parents hoped to pass on. Layla was thrilled to be a big sister, already teaching baby Dariush about investigative reporting techniques and the importance of protecting sources. Yasmin returned to work after maternity leave as the Post deputy editor for investigative projects, supervising the Refugee Journalist Fellowship and mentoring reporters from countries where journalism was dangerous. Owen scaled back his own ambitions slightly, recognizing that partnership meant supporting Yasmin's career with the same energy she brought to his, that fatherhood meant being present rather than just professionally successful. They built a life that honored both Yasmin's past and their shared future, a home filled with journalism awards in 3 languages, shelves of books about Iranian history and American politics, photos of Dariush's newsroom in Tehran, next to images of the Post's Pulitzer wall. Layla grew up bilingual, culturally fluent in both her parents' worlds, determined to become an investigative journalist who exposed injustice wherever she found it. Owen taught classes at Georgetown about investigative methodology, using Yasmin's Sentinel investigation as the gold standard for how to build corruption cases. Yasmin spoke at journalism schools about refugee experiences and credential recognition, ensuring the next generation of editors wouldn't dismiss translators as mere support staff. On their 5th anniversary, Owen and Yasmin co-published a book about the Sentinel investigation titled Truth in Translation: How Arrogance Nearly Buried a $3 billion fraud. The book detailed not just a conspiracy, but their unlikely partnership, Owen's growth from arrogant star reporter to collaborative journalist, and Yasmin's journey from basement translator to Pulitzer winner. It became required reading in journalism programs, a case study in how institutional blindness wastes talent and how humility enables truth. The dedication read, "To Dariush Tehrani, who taught Yasmin that journalism requires courage, and to translators everywhere, whose expertise deserves recognition." They never forgot the night in the basement when Yasmin had refused to certify Owen's translation, when she'd risked everything to protect truth over her paycheck. That moment became legendary in the Post newsroom, invoked whenever young reporters faced a choice between career advancement and journalistic integrity. Owen kept Yasmin's original investigation files framed in his office, a reminder of how close he'd come to catastrophic failure and how much he'd learned from the woman he'd initially dismissed. Yasmin kept the first draft of their Sentinel story, Owen's handwritten note at the top reading, primary byline, Yasmin Tehrani, proof that redemption was possible when arrogance gave way to respect. Their lives weren't perfect. Journalism deadlines still created stress. Raising kids while exposing corruption remained exhausting, and the immigrant experience never fully disappeared even with Pulitzers and prestigious positions. But they built something real from the wreckage of Owen's arrogance and the ashes of Yasmin's lost career, a partnership grounded in mutual respect, a family that honored multiple cultures, and a commitment to journalism that served truth rather than ego. And on difficult days, when investigations stalled or sources disappeared, they'd remember that basement confrontation that changed everything and know they'd chosen a harder, better path.